with that corner
Joe Burrow's dad, Jimmy, played defensive back at Nebraska. He was selected in the 8th round of the 1976 NFL draft. After 5 years in the CFL and 3 Grey Cups to show for it, he decided to coach defense. He coordinated that side of the ball starting in 1981 at Washington State. He did not stop until 2018, making stops at Nebraska, North Dakota State, Iowa State, and finally Ohio, where he settled. After retiring, well, you could see that he would like to watch Joe Burrow play. And Joe Burrow's brother, Jamie, played middle linebacker for the 2001 Huskers. He was a member of the squad that hustled to 11-2 and lost the national title 37-14 in Miami, or to Miami, excuse me. His brother Dan walked on at Nebraska to play safety, but Joe, he's more talented than Jimmy, Jamie, and Dan to let them tell it. Just check out these anecdotes that Mark Schlabach reported in his excellent profile. When Joe was about 2.5 years old, Jimmy taught him how to ride a bike on the artificial turf at Nebraska. He fell down just once, he got back up, didn't fall again. I lost count of how many times I fell. When Joe started playing flag football when he was about 6, Jimmy asked one of the Cornhuskers video assistants to film his games. He showed the tapes to Joe's older brothers later. Jamie remembers his brother, remember he's 6, dropping 40-yard bombs and having to ask his dad if that was normal. No, that's definitely not normal. When Joe was tall enough to dunk a basketball, he sent cell phone videos of him doing it to his older brothers. They observed that his friends were throwing the ball right over the rim and it was more like a tip-in than a dunk. So Jamie and Dan did what older brothers like to do. They teased their little brother Joe and told him his dunks weren't really authentic. A few weeks later, when they attended one of his games just before Christmas, Joe stole the ball at midcourt and threw down a tomahawk dunk, for which I might forever call Joe Burrow Billy Hoyle. Burrow played on a travel AAU basketball team when he was 9. During one state tournament in Columbus, Burrow's team was trailing by 8 points with about 30 seconds left to go. You've been right to think that the game was over, but Joe took it over, scoring 9 consecutive points, including 7 straight foul shots to lead his team to an improbable comeback. The other team, don't know why, but they kept fouling him. And maybe they thought what many of us would think, which is that he would have broke under the pressure, but he just kept making the shots. The coach of Joe's AAU team is a fellow named Tom Vanderveen. He's a professor at Ohio University, and he studied crimes. He's a sociology professor. And he studied the actors around them and the psychology that goes into criminals and those who pursue them. He observed in Joe the qualities we find in our first responders. He said, Joe's pulse doesn't change, no matter the situation he finds himself in. He could be mowing the lawn or pulling people from a fire, and his pulse would probably stay about the same. Do we not need that in our quarterbacks? Unlike the kind of men who end up leading Power 5 programs at quarterback, Joe didn't play at a high school power. Athens High had made the playoffs just twice until Joe showed up and started as a sophomore, but by the time his career ended, they'd won 37 games, 3 years. He threw for over 4,500 yards with 63 tutties as a senior, just lighting people up. It was actually Texas coach Tom Herman who brought Joe to Urban Meyer at Ohio State when he was the offensive coordinator there. He told Meyer, I found your next Alex Smith. But he wouldn't be that, not for Urban Meyer at least. When Joe arrived at Ohio State, he backed up JT Barrett, then broke his throwing hand and decided to grad transfer as the QB derby with future first-round pick Dwayne Haskins was just starting to heat up. If you listen to Urban Meyer, he says they were neck and neck until Joe decided to transfer to LSU. Started right away, and you know how this went. The Tigers went 10-3 with him as their quarterback. Now, in 2019, through 6 games, Joe has been ridiculously good in LSU offensive coordinator Steve Ensminger's scheme, helped by Joe Brady, of course. He's completed 79% of his passes for 2,157 yards with 3 touchdowns against just 3 interceptions. The worst game he's played so far was a 42-7 shellacking of Utah State, where he completed 71.4% of his passes for 344 yards, 5 touchdowns, and a pick. The best game, 21-24 for 293 with 3 tutties against an undefeated and top 10 Florida squad. 87.5% completion rate. It's going to get it done, man. The Bayou Bengals face Mississippi State this week, and they ought to boat race them, if we're being honest. And then they get the Iron Bowl participants, Auburn and Alabama. Auburn ain't great, but their defense is good. Bama's powered by Tua Tagovailoa and a murderer's row of wideouts. But if Joe and LSU continue to show like they have, there might not be any need to play the Iron Bowl. The 2019 Alabama State title might just end up in Baton Rouge. All right, I want to talk a bit about college football playoff contenders and what's left to be said about the Power 5 guys who are still undefeated after, well, we're halfway through football season. So there are a couple of, well, teams that I want to talk about that are finally going to get something like tested. The top of the list has to be Ohio State. Now, I know that a lot of folks aren't necessarily thrilled by Ohio State traveling to Evanston to play Pat Fitzgerald, noted Luddite, and, Union Breaker. His Northwestern Wildcats, I got nothing for J schools. I just know that their defense has been pretty great, and just ask Wisconsin about that. And I've wanted to see what Ohio State looks like when they play a great defense, to which you would be right to remind me, yo man, isn't Michigan State a great defense? Yes, and I guess that's kind of the point, right? If Ohio State continues to play the way that they've been playing, now that they beat Michigan State, who was a top 25 team, and they'll probably roll up Northwestern on a Friday night, and I contend that if you want to be my national champion, I need you to roll up the smart schools. That means Northwestern, Stanford, and the like. So they're obviously a favorite, but they also get Wisconsin next week, man, and Wisconsin is scary good, man. Like, first team to hold, what is it, 4 shutouts in 6 games. First team to do that since Oklahoma in 1967. First team to do that in the Big Ten since 1962. They're a juggernaut. They know who they are. They have an identity. They play to that identity. They have continuity in their coaches. I enjoy them. Jim Leonard, going to be a head coach somewhere, wants to be at Wisconsin. We'll probably have to wait and see for that. But that defense is lights out. We know what Jonathan Taylor is with 825 yards rushing. Can Jack Cohen actually pass them into a game if they get stopped by the run? But doesn't look like doesn't look like anybody's going to stop that rushing attack. So they still have something left to play for in a couple of weeks, right? And then we could look at this situation where we could end up, even now, with 2 Big Ten teams in the college football playoff if things break correctly. And for those things to break correctly, 2 things have to happen, right? Ohio State and Wisconsin have to get 2 Big Ten championship. And the other thing that has to happen, Alabama, LSU have to lose. And one of them will, right? So we're really talking about Clemson, Oklahoma, and yes, Penn State will get there. But I wanted to just outline that because those 2 teams are really, really good. They're playing some outstanding football. We'll get to see what they're made of here in a little bit. My mom's calling me. I'll call her back. So that leads me to Penn State, Michigan, which I know is the game of the week for some, right? And I get why. It's a whiteout game. Penn State is undefeated. They look like a juggernaut defensively. They're good enough offensively. Noah Cain is proving to be their guy, although Journey Brown might actually end up being something. I don't expect much out of the Maize and Blue. I expect quite a bit out of the Nittany Lions because they're still in this place that we kind of put them in with Auburn when they were undefeated of, I don't really trust you. And seeing as you have, these teams left on your schedule, notably Ohio State, we're going to get to find out whether or not you're for real. And if you're for real, fine. By all means, get there. But I just don't think that you are. Moving right along, Minnesota, 6-0. I get it. They got to feel real good if they're Golden Gophers, but they're about to run into perhaps 6-6 if they don't get this thing started here real quick. Now, they're going to come up against some ranked opponents that, quite frankly, I think are going to beat their brains in. So I'm not really thinking about them in a real way right now. Clemson is in a watered-down conference. I understand if you're down on Clemson, but you need to just continue to think, hey, would you want to go up against that Clemson offense? No, probably not. Even if it's not Trevor Lawrence that you're unafraid of, you ought to be afraid of Travis Etienne, and you ought to be afraid of Justin Ross, T. Higgins, and the like. And Brent Venables can still scheme up something that's going to cause nightmares for you. Then we're talking about Oklahoma, who plays West Virginia, who's going to probably finish at the bottom of the conference next to Kansas. So for many, it's about, does this defense that you saw against Texas show up against West Virginia? Can they keep that rolling? But really, we're talking about Oklahoma State, Baylor right now, challenging, and perhaps Iowa State. But I think through the middle of the Big 12 is actually pretty stout, and there aren't any really just notch them up wins after this one with Kansas State, TCU, and of course Iowa State, Baylor, and Oklahoma State left to play. We'll just have to see in this round robin what happens. Now, I get where you're going with Baylor, right? You're going, hey, they're one of the best scoring defensive teams in the country. They get sacks, they get tackles for loss. They also played Tech close, and they probably should have lost that game to Tech, but I think Oklahoma State has more firepower, and I don't think Baylor's going to be there at the end because they got to go through both Oklahoma and Texas still. I just don't see it for them. I would be remiss if I don't bring up some of the other squads that I know y'all are high on that are one-loss teams like Oregon, who could go get their first ranked win against Washington. We'll see about that. Arizona State, of course, is still there. We could talk about some others that are one loss that are still there, but I'm not really having this conversation about Auburn because I don't want to. Alabama, yes, I get it. The run defense is not porous, but it ain't great either. And there might be a lot of garbage yards that we continue to add into the statistical totals when we're talking about what Alabama is going to be or how they could be. I still think that having 4 true freshmen starting in your front 7 is a liability and not the way that you draw it up. And that'll get exposed later on in the season because after Tennessee, then they finally get to start playing some people like LSU, right, who we talked about, and of course Auburn, who we talked about. I think up there at the top, I could take any one of the 6 at the top. If you're talking Alabama, LSU, Georgia I know has the one loss, but we'll just see how that figures out for them, whether or not they get the SEC championship game. Of course, you're talking about Oklahoma, Wisconsin, Ohio State, and on. I think a lot of this is going to get sorted out in October. What doesn't get sorted out in October will probably be sorted out by the second week in November, and then we'll have our 4. But if you're asking me today, and you are, I'm talking about Ohio State. No, I'm not. I'm talking about Wisconsin. I keep going back on this thing. Wisconsin, Oklahoma, because the road there is just that easy, and they should not get a lot of, the mistakes they make will be mistakes that they make. It won't be because somebody else is actually better than them the rest of the way. So you're talking about Wisconsin, you're talking about Oklahoma, you're talking about the winner of LSU, Bama. So let's go with LSU right now because I just did this whole thing on LSU. And then, maybe, Clemson. But if Clemson drops one, that's all she wrote. So right now, we're going Wisconsin, we're going Oklahoma, we're going LSU, we're going Clemson. College football playoff contenders right now. All right, that's it for me. Deuces.